Imagine walking through the fog-covered streets of Columbus, Ohio, in 1878, where the smell of coal smoke mixes with something else, something that makes mothers pull their children closer and dogs refuse to bark. Rising from the industrial wasteland stands a seven-story fortress of red brick and iron that locals call the Gallows City. Built for $237,000, nearly $7 million in today's money, the Ohio State Penitentiary was designed to hold 200 criminals. But it held something far more dangerous, a secret justice system that operated in the shadows, where informants faced a death sentence not from the state, but from the very men they shared cells with. On a cold morning in April 1879, prison officials discovered something that would shatter their illusion of control forever. Hanging from a walkway railing, swaying in the morning breeze like strange fruit, was the body of Thomas Kellerman, executed not by the state's gallows, but by a rope fashioned from bedsheets and the collective rage of desperate men. The official report called it suicide. The inmates knew better, and what they knew would transform American prisons forever. Today, we're opening the sealed files on America's most notorious prison execution, not the ones carried out by the state, but the one carried out by the condemned themselves. This is the true story of how architecture became complicit in murder, how justice became a weapon, and how the Ohio State Penitentiary became a laboratory for the kind of violence that law was designed to prevent. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of American history where official records end and forbidden truths begin, you're in the right place. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the stories they tried to bury. In the pre-dawn darkness of Columbus, Ohio, fog rolls between the brick smokestacks like the breath of something sleeping. The year is 1878. And rising from the industrial haze stands a structure that will come to define the thin line between justice and vengeance in America. They call it the Ohio State Penitentiary, but the locals have another name for it: the Gallows City. The penitentiary sits less than a mile from the Ohio State House, a deliberate positioning that speaks to the duality of power in 19th-century America. On one side, lawmakers debate the fine points of governance in marble halls. On the other, the state's ultimate authority manifests in brick and iron, a fortress designed to hold human beings until they die, either by natural causes or by the rope. The proximity is no accident. It serves as a daily reminder that democracy and death are often next-door neighbors. The building emerges from the morning mist like a medieval fortress transplanted to the American Midwest. 7 stories of red brick punctuated by narrow windows that barely deserve the name. Each window is precisely 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall, dimensions calculated not for light or air, but for security. No man could squeeze through such an opening, even if the iron bars weren't there to ensure it. The architecture speaks a language older than America itself. This is not rehabilitation made manifest in stone. This is punishment as monument, deterrence as spectacle. The very sight of its walls is meant to turn potential criminals away from their intended path. But deterrence is a theory, and theories often collide with reality in ways their architects never anticipate. Walk through the working-class neighborhoods that surround the penitentiary, and you'll notice something peculiar. Children don't play near the walls. Mothers pull their laundry inside when the wind shifts toward the prison. Dogs refuse to bark in certain directions. The building casts a shadow longer than physics would suggest, a darkness that seems to seep into the very soil of Columbus. The penitentiary's execution chamber sits in the northeast corner of the complex, positioned so that the condemned man's final walk takes him past the cells of those who might one day follow. This walk, exactly 137 steps from death row to the gallows, becomes known among inmates as the Green Mile. Though the floors are gray concrete, polished smooth by thousands of shuffling feet. But there's something the architects didn't anticipate, something that won't reveal itself for years. Inside these walls, another justice system is forming. It operates without courts, without judges, without the pretense of due process. It answers to older laws, written not in statute books, but in the survival instincts of desperate men, The state may control the official gallows, but the inmates are building their own. The land beneath the penitentiary tells its own story of American pragmatism. In 1875, the Ohio General Assembly faced a problem common to growing states: where to put the criminals. The old penitentiary in downtown Columbus was overcrowded, undersized, and embarrassingly outdated. Lawmakers needed space, and they needed it cheap. They found their answer in 37 acres of industrial wasteland on the city's west side. The land had been used for manufacturing, then abandoned when the factories moved closer to the river. It was marshy, prone to flooding, and considered unsuitable for residential development. Perfect, in other words, for housing people society had already written off. The purchase price was $23,000, roughly $650,000 in today's money. It was a bargain, the kind of deal that makes legislators feel clever. They were buying not just land, but distance. Distance from the respectable neighborhoods where voters lived, distance from the schools where their children learned about justice and mercy, distance from the churches where they prayed for the salvation of souls they'd rather not think about. The rail lines ran within a quarter-mile of the site, which solved several logistical problems at once. Inmates could be transported directly from county jails across Ohio without parading them through city streets. Construction materials, brick, mortar, iron, could be delivered efficiently, and when the time came to transport bodies, whether to families who claimed them or to the potter's field that didn't, the railroad offered discretion that horse-drawn hearses could not. But the rail lines brought something else, something the planners didn't consider. They brought sound. Every freight train that rumbled past the prison walls carried with it a reminder of the world beyond, a world of movement, of freedom, of destinations that mattered. For the men locked inside, that sound would become both torture and hope, a daily reminder of everything they'd lost and everything they might never regain. The marshy ground presented challenges from the beginning. Drainage systems had to be installed before construction could begin, but drainage was expensive, and the budget was tight. Corners were cut. Compromises were made. The result was a foundation that would never be entirely dry, walls that would sweat in summer and freeze in winter, and air that would always carry the faint smell of dampness and decay. Water has a way of finding weakness, and weakness, once found, spreads like infection. The moisture that seeped through the prison's foundation would do more than damage brick and mortar. It would create an environment where disease flourished, where hope died, and where the line between civilization and barbarism became as fluid as the water that never stopped finding new ways inside. The architectural plans for the penitentiary arrive in Columbus in the spring of 1876, shipped by rail from a firm in Boston that specializes in what they call correctional architecture. The plans are impressive, precise blueprints detailing a structure designed to hold 1,200 inmates in individual cells with workshops, dining halls, and administrative offices arranged around a central courtyard. The design philosophy is simple: visibility equals control. The cell blocks are arranged in a spoke pattern, radiating from a central hub where guards can observe multiple corridors simultaneously. It's called the panopticon design, borrowed from the theories of philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who believed that the possibility of constant observation would modify behavior more effectively than actual punishment. Each cell block rises 7 stories, with narrow catwalks connecting the tiers like the rigging of a great ship. The catwalks are precisely 4 feet wide, enough for a guard to pass, but narrow enough that inmates cannot gather in groups. The railings are solid iron, designed to support the weight of a man leaning against them, but engineered to discourage climbing. The cells themselves are marvels of efficient brutality. 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 7 feet high. Each contains a steel cot, bolted to the wall, a small shelf, and a waste bucket. Ventilation comes from a single slot near the ceiling, too small for a man to reach and too high to offer any view of the outside world. The dimensions are calculated to provide just enough space for a human body to exist, but not enough for a human spirit to flourish. The walls between cells are 12 inches thick, double the width needed for structural integrity. This isn't about supporting weight, it's about dampening sound. The architects understand that silence is a weapon as powerful as iron bars. Cut a man off from meaningful communication with his fellow prisoners, and you cut him off from the solidarity that might sustain hope. But there's a flaw in the design, visible only to someone who understands the physics of sound in enclosed spaces. The high ceilings and hard surfaces create acoustic conditions that amplify whispers while muffling normal conversation. A man speaking softly at one end of a corridor can be heard clearly at the other end, while someone speaking at normal volume becomes unintelligible. The architecture that was meant to prevent communication actually enables a new form of it, quiet, careful, and invisible to guards who expect to hear trouble coming. The construction contract goes to Brennan and Sons, an Irish firm with experience building everything from churches to slaughterhouses. The irony isn't lost on the inmates who will eventually occupy the cells. Their prison is being built by men who understand the architecture of both salvation and death. The spring of 1877 brings news that will reshape the penitentiary before its first inmate arrives. Construction costs are running 40% over budget. The limestone facing that was supposed to give the building a stately appearance has been replaced with cheaper brick. The workshop space has been reduced by half. Most critically, the guard stations that were planned for each cell block have been consolidated, reducing the planned staff from 60 guards to 37. The state legislature, faced with mounting costs and an impatient public, makes a decision that will echo through the decades. Rather than increase funding, they'll make do with less. Fewer guards, thinner walls, smaller spaces. The machine for holding men will operate on a skeleton crew, relying on fear and routine to maintain order where presence and vigilance were originally planned. The irony cuts deep. In their effort to build a prison economically, the lawmakers are creating the very conditions that will make economy impossible. A prison that cannot maintain control is a prison that cannot maintain anything, not security, not order, not life itself. But these consequences lie in the future, hidden beneath the satisfaction of staying within budget. By winter, the construction crews are working double shifts to meet the spring opening deadline. The sound of hammers and saws echoes through the surrounding neighborhoods from dawn to dusk. Local residents complain about the noise, but their protests fall on deaf ears. After all, they were warned when they chose to live near a prison. The inconvenience of construction is nothing compared to the inconvenience of justice. The final cost comes to $237,000, nearly $7 million in today's money. It's a substantial sum, but still less than what a proper prison would have cost. The savings come from everywhere: thinner walls, fewer guards, smaller cells, inadequate drainage. Each compromise seems minor in isolation, but together they create a structure that looks like a prison but functions like a powder keg waiting for a spark. On April 15, 1878, the Ohio State Penitentiary officially opens its doors. The ceremony is modest: a few speeches from state officials, a blessing from the prison chaplain, and a tour for local newspaper reporters who describe the facility as a monument to Ohio's commitment to both justice and progress. The first inmates arrive by train 2 days later. 73 men, shackled in pairs, shuffling from the rail cars to the prison gates, while a small crowd of curious onlookers watches from across the street. The men are a cross-section of Ohio's criminal class: murderers and thieves, forgers and rapists, some barely old enough to shave and others bent with age. What they share is the common fate of incarceration in a building designed by people who will never occupy its cells. The intake process is efficient and dehumanizing. Personal belongings are confiscated and cataloged. Names are replaced with numbers. Civilian clothes are exchanged for gray uniforms cut from cloth so coarse it chafes the skin. Each man is issued a metal cup, a spoon, and a thin blanket that will serve as his only protection against the damp cold that seeps through the walls. The cell assignments follow no apparent logic. Young men are housed next to old ones, first-time offenders beside career criminals, the violent mixed with the merely unfortunate. The administrators claim this random distribution prevents the formation of criminal alliances, but the inmates quickly realize something else. It prevents the formation of any alliances at all, criminal or otherwise. Isolation is the goal, and isolation is achieved. But within hours of their arrival, the inmates begin to notice something the architects hadn't anticipated. The prison is full of blind spots, corners where the guard towers can't see, alcoves where the catwalks don't reach, spaces between the buildings where a man could disappear for minutes at a time. These spaces become maps in their minds, routes to be memorized and shared through the strange acoustics that carry whispers across cell blocks. The first contraband appears within a week. A knife fashioned from a broken spoon handle. A rope braided from torn bedsheets. Nothing elaborate, nothing that suggests sophisticated criminal organization. Just the natural ingenuity of desperate men adapting to an environment designed to crush adaptation. The guards find some of it during random searches, but they suspect they're finding only a fraction of what exists. The inmates learn the building faster than their captors because they have to. For the guards, the prison is a place of work, 8 hours at a time, 5 days a week. For the inmates, it's the entire universe, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years or decades or until death. They study every sound, every shadow, every weakness, because their survival depends on understanding the machine that holds them. Within the first month, the fundamental dynamic is established. The guards control the keys and the official schedule. The inmates control everything else, the informal economy, the communication networks, the unwritten rules that determine who lives, who dies, and who disappears into the blind spots that shouldn't exist, but do. The old laws still apply inside the walls, but they compete with newer laws written in violence and silence. These laws have no legislators, no courts, no appeals process. They exist in the space between what's official and what's real, between what's legal and what's necessary for survival. And in that space, the inmates begin to establish their own form of justice, rougher and more immediate than anything the state provides. It operates on different principles. Information is currency, weakness is death, and silence is the only protection worth having. Those who violate the code face consequences that no official court would sanction, but which the architecture of the prison makes not just possible, but inevitable. The inmate code crystallizes during the prison's second month of operation, emerging from necessity rather than tradition. It's simple enough that illiterate men can understand it, flexible enough to adapt to circumstances, and brutal enough to ensure compliance. The first rule is absolute. Silence equals survival. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of complicity. You see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing that might reach the ears of a guard. This code exists in the space between the official rules and the reality of prison life. The official rules say that inmates must report violations to the guards. The reality is that reporting violations is a death sentence carried out by men who have nothing left to lose. The administration knows about this contradiction, but chooses to ignore it, because acknowledging it would require admitting that their control is an illusion. The second rule follows naturally from the first. Debts are paid in full. Not just monetary debts, though cigarettes and food from home have their own exchange rates, but debts of respect, debts of protection, debts of blood. The state may have taken away their freedom, but it cannot take away their sense of justice, no matter how twisted that justice might become in the confines of 8-by-4-foot cells. Informants exist in every prison, but in the Ohio State Penitentiary, they occupy a particularly precarious position. The guards depend on them for information about planned escapes, brewing violence, and hidden contraband. But the thin staff and inadequate supervision mean that informants cannot be protected once their identities become known. They exist in a twilight world, useful to the administration but expendable, protected by promises that everyone knows cannot be kept. The third rule is the most dangerous. Justice delayed is justice transferred. If the official system fails to address a wrong, if a guard looks the other way when an inmate is assaulted, if a theft goes unpunished or a rape unavenged, then justice becomes the responsibility of the inmates themselves. And inmate justice recognizes no appeals, no mitigating circumstances, no mercy for the deserving or undeserving alike. The guards hear whispers of this shadow system, but dismiss them as the natural posturing of caged men. They don't understand that the whispers are not threats but promises, not boasts but planning. The acoustic design that carries soft voices across cell blocks also carries information about who has violated the code, who deserves punishment, and who has been selected to deliver it. Summer arrives early in 1878, and with it comes the first test of the prison's ability to maintain order. The temperature inside the cell blocks rises to 90 degrees, then 95, then over 100. The narrow windows provide no relief, and the thick walls that were supposed to provide security instead trap heat like an oven. Men begin to collapse during work details. Tempers flare over trivial disputes. The administrators respond by reducing the work schedule and increasing water rations, but they cannot address the fundamental problem. 700 men are now crammed into a space designed for 600, and the overcrowding makes everything worse. The cells that were barely tolerable with one occupant become hellish with two. The corridors that were narrow by design become impassable during movement between shifts. And in this pressure cooker environment, the first serious violation of the inmate code occurs. A man named Thomas Kellerman, serving 5 years for armed robbery, approaches a guard during the evening meal and whispers something in his ear. The guard nods and makes a note in his logbook. Kellerman returns to his table, unaware that a dozen pairs of eyes have watched the exchange and interpreted its meaning. The information Kellerman provides leads to a midnight raid on 3 cells, where guards discover a cache of homemade weapons and several bottles of illegal alcohol. 6 inmates are thrown into solitary confinement. The guards consider it a successful operation, proof that their informant network is functioning as designed. But the informant network has another component the guards don't fully understand. For every piece of information that flows from inmates to guards, 10 pieces flow between the inmates themselves. And the information now flowing through the cell blocks is that Thomas Kellerman has crossed the line from prisoner to collaborator, from one of them to one of the enemy. The mathematics of prison justice are simple and final. Kellerman may have gained temporary favor with the guards, but he has lost something far more valuable: the protection of silence. His name is now spoken in whispers that carry across the cell blocks, and those whispers are not prayers for his salvation. They are calculations of his worth, measurements of his remaining time, and plans for his inevitable reckoning. The problem is that Kellerman doesn't know any of this. The guards who recruited him promised protection, but never defined what that protection would look like or how it would be delivered. In their minds, protection means occasional isolated housing and preferential work assignments. In the minds of the inmates, protection means nothing at all unless it can be maintained 24 hours a day by guards who work 8-hour shifts and who cannot see around every corner of a building designed with too many corners. As summer fades into autumn, Thomas Kellerman continues his work as an informant, unaware that each piece of information he provides tightens the noose around his own neck. He reports on escape plans that never had a chance of success, contraband that was meant to be found, and conversations that were conducted for his benefit. The other inmates are feeding him information designed to test his loyalty to the code, and he is failing every test. The guards, meanwhile, congratulate themselves on the quality of their intelligence network. They don't realize they're being fed a steady diet of controlled information, carefully calibrated to make them feel successful while protecting the activities that actually matter. The real escape plans, the real weapons, the real violence remains hidden in the acoustic shadows and blind spots that the architects never intended to create. By December, Thomas Kellerman's situation has become untenable, though he's the only person in the Ohio State Penitentiary who doesn't know it. The guards trust him, the inmates have marked him for death, and the architecture that was supposed to prevent such situations from arising has instead made them inevitable, creating spaces where justice can be administered outside the reach of official oversight. The winter snow begins to fall, covering the prison walls with a clean white blanket that will soon be stained with consequences no one saw coming but everyone should have expected. 5. 12 p.m. The first blizzard of 1879 arrives on January 7th, bringing with it the kind of cold that turns breath to ice and makes steel brittle as glass. The heating system in the Ohio State Penitentiary, designed by the same cost-cutting philosophy that governed every other aspect of construction, proves woefully inadequate. Coal burns in the basement furnaces, but the heat rises unevenly through the building, creating pockets of relative warmth, surrounded by zones where the temperature barely climbs above freezing. In the upper tiers of the cell blocks where hot air should collect, but somehow doesn't, inmates wrap themselves in every piece of cloth they can find. Blankets become precious commodities, traded for favors that will be remembered long after the weather warms. The thin prison uniforms offer no protection against the cold that seeps through walls never properly sealed, through windows that fit poorly in their frames, through floors laid over foundations that still weep moisture from the marshy ground below. The guards at least can retreat to heated offices between their rounds. The inmates have nowhere to go but deeper into themselves, into whatever reserves of endurance and rage have sustained them thus far. Desperation has its own temperature, and in the Ohio State Penitentiary that winter, desperation burns hotter than the inadequate coal furnaces struggling in the basement. Thomas Kellerman occupies cell block C, Tier 4, cell 27. The cell faces north, which means it receives no direct sunlight even on clear days. His cellmate, a forger named William Hatch, serving 3 years for counterfeiting, has stopped speaking to him entirely. The silence isn't personal. It's protective. Hatch knows what Kellerman apparently doesn't. That association with a marked man can be fatal. The daily routine continues despite the cold. Roll call at 6 in the morning when the air is so frigid that speaking hurts and breathing creates clouds that obscure faces. Work details that move more slowly than usual, not from laziness, but from the simple physics of frozen joints and numb fingers. Meals eaten quickly before the metal plates conduct heat away from food that was barely warm when it was served. But routine, in a prison where routine has been weaponized as a tool of control, creates its own opportunities. The guards, focused on maintaining the schedule that gives their days meaning, pay less attention to the small deviations that might signal larger problems. A conversation that lasts 10 seconds longer than usual. A glance that lingers a moment too long. A man who changes direction in a corridor for no apparent reason. These deviations accumulate like snowflakes, individually meaningless but collectively building towards something that will reshape the landscape. And at the center of this accumulation is Thomas Kellerman, walking through his days unaware that each step brings him closer to a reckoning, calculated in whispers he cannot hear, and planned in spaces he cannot see. The work details during winter are necessarily different from those in warmer months. Outdoor labor becomes impossible when the temperature drops below zero, so the inmates are moved to indoor workshops where they manufacture items for the state, license plates, furniture, textiles. The workshops are cramped, poorly lit, and filled with tools that could become weapons in the wrong hands, or the right hands, depending on your perspective. Kellerman works in the textile workshop, operating a loom that produces cotton cloth for state hospitals and schools. The work requires concentration, which provides him some protection from the social dynamics playing out around him. But it also isolates him, makes him predictable, establishes patterns that can be studied and exploited by men who have nothing to do but study and exploit. The textile workshop is located on the second floor of the industrial building, connected to the main prison by a covered walkway that spans 30 feet above the courtyard. The walkway is enclosed but unheated, making it one of the coldest places in the entire complex. Guards avoid it when possible, preferring to communicate with the workshop supervisors by telephone rather than make the frigid journey in person. This isolation creates opportunities, and opportunities in prison are rare enough to be treated as precious resources. The walkway becomes a place where conversations can occur without official observation, where plans can be made without electronic ears listening, where justice can be discussed without interference from those who claim to dispense it. February brings a thaw that turns the prison grounds into a muddy bog, but inside the cell blocks, nothing changes. The dampness that has plagued the building since construction increases, creating an environment where mold grows in corners and respiratory infections spread from cell to cell. The prison infirmary, staffed by a single doctor who visits twice a week, becomes overwhelmed with cases of pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other diseases that flourish in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Thomas Kellerman develops a cough that keeps his cellmate awake at night. William Hatch requests a transfer to another cell, claiming medical necessity. His request is denied. Transfers require paperwork, and paperwork requires time that the skeleton staff doesn't have. So Hatch endures the sleepless nights, adding his name to the growing list of inmates who have been personally inconvenienced by the snitch in cell 27. Personal inconvenience, in a place where every comfort has been stripped away, becomes personal hatred. And personal hatred, multiplied by dozens of men living in conditions that would break most people's spirits, becomes something larger and more dangerous than any individual grudge. It becomes a collective understanding that Thomas Kellerman represents everything wrong with their world. Not the guards who locked them up, not the judges who sentenced them, not the politicians who built this place, but the man among them who chose collaboration over solidarity. The mathematics are simple. Kellerman has betrayed trust for minor privileges. He has chosen temporary safety over permanent belonging. He has violated the most fundamental rule of survival in a place where survival itself is a form of resistance. And for these betrayals, he must pay a price that will serve as education for anyone else tempted to make the same choice. The prison library, such as it is, occupies a single room on the third floor of the administration building. It contains perhaps 300 books, mostly religious texts and outdated technical manuals, along with a few dozen magazines from which anything controversial has been carefully removed. Inmates are allowed access to the library for 1 hour per week, under the supervision of a guard who spends most of his time reading newspapers at a desk near the door. The library serves functions beyond its official purpose. It's one of the few places where inmates from different cell blocks can encounter each other legitimately, where conversations can occur under the pretense of discussing literature or religion, where information can be exchanged through the ancient art of notes hidden in book pages. The guard, focused on his newspapers, rarely notices when books are returned to the wrong shelves or when certain volumes seem to circulate more frequently than others. Thomas Kellerman visits the library every Tuesday afternoon, drawn by a genuine interest in reading that sets him apart from most of the other inmates. He favors adventure stories and detective novels, finding in their pages an escape from the monotony of prison routine. But his presence in the library serves another purpose. It makes him predictable, establishes a weekly pattern that can be relied upon by those planning his future. March arrives with unseasonable warmth, and the prison administration decides it's time to resume outdoor work details. The grounds need maintenance after the hard winter, and the state has contracts to fulfill. Inmates are organized into work gangs and march to various locations around the complex. Some to repair damage to the walls, others to tend the vegetable garden that supplements the prison's food supply. Still others to maintain the railroad siding where supplies arrive and bodies depart. Thomas Kellerman is assigned to a work detail responsible for maintaining the walkway between the main building and the industrial complex. It's considered light duty, appropriate for someone who has been cooperative and whose cough still lingers from the winter's illnesses. The detail consists of 6 men supervised by a single guard, and their job is to inspect the walkway for structural damage, repair loose boards, and ensure that the railing system meets safety standards. The irony is lost on everyone except the men who plan to kill him. Thomas Kellerman, the informant who betrayed his fellow inmates for promises of protection that were never kept, has been assigned to inspect and repair the very structure that will serve as his gallows. The railing he checks for structural integrity will soon be tested by the weight of his body. The walkway he helps to maintain will become the site of his execution. But Kellerman notices none of this. He sees only the routine of work, the mild warmth of early spring, the simple satisfaction of tasks completed and responsibilities fulfilled. He doesn't notice that conversations stop when he approaches, or that certain inmates have begun to position themselves where they can observe his movements without seeming to do so. He doesn't understand that his predictable patterns have become a weapon pointed at his own heart. The walkway work detail operates with minimal supervision. The guard, a man named Peterson who has worked at the prison for less than a year, treats the assignment as an opportunity to enjoy the spring weather while earning his pay with minimal effort. He establishes himself at one end of the walkway with a chair and a thermos of coffee, occasionally glancing up from his magazine to ensure that the 6 inmates under his supervision remain busy with their assigned tasks. Peterson's relaxed approach to supervision creates exactly the kind of opportunity that the prison's architecture was supposed to prevent. The walkway spans 30 feet and includes several support structures that block clear sight lines. An inmate working at the far end of the walkway can be invisible to the guard for minutes at a time. These blind spots, created by cost-cutting measures and inadequate design, become the spaces where unofficial justice operates most efficiently. The inmates on the work detail understand this dynamic better than their supervisor. They organize their work to maximize these invisible moments, using them for conversations that would be impossible in the cell blocks, for planning that requires privacy, and for the kind of coordination that turns individual grievances into collective action. They work slowly, efficiently, and with the kind of attention to detail that has nothing to do with maintaining a walkway and everything to do with maintaining the inmate code. By the middle of March, the plan has crystallized into something as simple and inevitable as gravity. Thomas Kellerman will die on the walkway where he works, killed by men who share his daily routine, using tools that the state has provided and a structure that the state has built. The execution will occur during official work hours, under the theoretical supervision of a state employee, using methods that leave no fingerprints and no evidence beyond the obvious fact of death itself. The beauty of the plan, if beauty is the right word for something so brutal, lies in its simplicity. No weapons need to be smuggled or hidden. No elaborate schemes need to be coordinated across multiple cell blocks. No guards need to be bribed or distracted. The prison itself will provide everything necessary for the execution of its own informant. Rope fashioned from work materials, a structure capable of supporting the weight, and blind spots that turn supervision into illusion. Thomas Kellerman continues to work on the walkway, continues to inspect railings and repair loose boards, continues to believe that his cooperation with the guards has earned him some measure of protection. He doesn't know that his protection extends only as far as the guard's line of sight, and that the guard's line of sight has been carefully studied and found wanting. He doesn't know that the rope being braided from hemp fibers is being braided for him. He doesn't know that the structure he helps to maintain will soon maintain his corpse. The final week of March brings news that changes everything while changing nothing. Word spreads through the cell blocks that Thomas Kellerman has provided information leading to the discovery of an escape tunnel that had been under construction for months. 6 inmates are thrown into solitary confinement. Weeks of careful planning and dangerous labor are reduced to nothing. And the inmate who made it possible continues to walk among them, breathing their air, eating their food, occupying space in a world where space itself has become precious. The news travels through the acoustic networks that connect every corner of the prison, carried by whispers that transform facts into verdicts and verdicts into death sentences. There will be no trial, no appeals, no last-minute reprieves. The justice system that matters has already weighed the evidence and reached its conclusion. Thomas Kellerman must die, and he must die in a way that teaches everyone else what happens to those who choose collaboration over solidarity. The date is set without being spoken aloud. The method is agreed upon without being discussed. The participants are selected without being named. Everything necessary for justice has been arranged through the silent communication networks that turn a building designed to prevent coordination into a machine that makes coordination inevitable. April 1st, 1879. The morning arrives gray and cold, with the kind of drizzle that turns dirt to mud and makes metal surfaces slippery. The work details form as usual in the courtyard, with inmates lined up in groups of 6 under the supervision of guards who seem more concerned with staying dry than maintaining perfect discipline. Thomas Kellerman takes his usual place in the walkway maintenance detail, coughing slightly in the damp air, unaware that this will be the last morning of his life. The routine unfolds with the precision of a clock mechanism. Breakfast at 6, roll call at 7, work assignments distributed by 7:30. The walkway detail receives its tools, hammers, nails, coils of rope for repairs, from the supply room and begins the short march to their assigned area. Guard Peterson follows behind, already anticipating the comfort of his chair and the warmth of his coffee thermos. The walkway stretches before them like a bridge between worlds. The main prison building on one side, where men sleep and eat and count the days until their sentences end, and the industrial building on the other, where they labor to produce goods for a society that has rejected them. It's an appropriate place for what will happen next, a liminal space where the rules of both worlds apply and the protections of neither can be guaranteed. The morning's work proceeds normally for almost 2 hours. Boards are inspected and replaced, railings are tested and tightened. The guard reads his magazine and drinks his coffee, occasionally glancing up to ensure that his charges remain busy. The routine is so familiar that it has become invisible, which makes it perfect for concealing activities that must not be seen. At 9:15, Guard Peterson announces that he needs to speak with the workshop supervisor about a change in the afternoon schedule. He'll be gone for 10 minutes, 15 at most. The inmates should continue working and not move from the walkway. He disappears into the industrial building, leaving 6 men alone with their tools and their grievances and their understanding of what must be done. The transformation happens in seconds. Thomas Kellerman, bent over a loose board at the far end of the walkway, looks up to find himself surrounded by 5 men whose faces tell him everything he needs to know about his immediate future. There are no speeches, no explanations, no opportunities for pleas or bargains. The time for words ended weeks ago when he chose information over integrity. The rope, already prepared and hidden among the legitimate repair materials, emerges from a tool bag like a snake uncoiling. Hands that have grown strong from prison labor seize Kellerman's arms and legs, lifting him with surprising gentleness toward the railing he has helped to maintain. The irony is perfect. The informant will be executed with tools provided by the state, using a structure built with his own labor during a window of time created by the inadequate supervision that his information was supposed to help improve. Thomas Kellerman struggles, but the struggle is brief and futile. 5 men against 1, rope against flesh, gravity against hope. The noose, fashioned with the same attention to detail that characterizes all successful prison innovations, settles around his neck with the weight of inevitability. His feet leave the walkway, and for a moment he hangs suspended between the world he has betrayed and the world he tried to join, belonging fully to neither. The railing holds, the rope holds, the silence holds. Thomas Kellerman stops struggling and becomes still, swaying slightly in the morning breeze like strange fruit hanging from a steel tree. Below in the courtyard, other inmates glance up and then quickly away, understanding without being told that they have witnessed something both terrible and necessary, both criminal and just. When Guard Peterson returns 12 minutes later, he finds 5 inmates standing around the body of the 6th, their faces registering the kind of shock that suggests they have discovered, rather than created, the scene before them. No one speaks. No one moves. The only sound is the slight creaking of rope against metal, as Thomas Kellerman's body turns slowly in the wind that carries the smell of rain and the promise of a long spring ahead. The discovery freezes time for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for Guard Peterson to process what he's seeing, long enough for the 5 surviving inmates to understand that their lives have just changed forever, long enough for the Ohio State Penitentiary to cross a line from which there will be no return. Then time lurches back into motion with a sharp blast of Peterson's whistle, a sound that cuts through the morning air like a blade through silence. The response is immediate, but not coordinated. Guards pour into the courtyard from 3 different directions, some carrying weapons they rarely use, others empty-handed, but moving with the urgency that comes from knowing something has gone catastrophically wrong. The first to arrive is Sergeant Williams. a 20-year veteran whose experience with prison violence has taught him to secure the scene before asking questions that might never receive honest answers. Williams takes one look at the body hanging from the walkway railing and makes decisions that will echo through the decades. First, cut down the corpse, not out of respect for the dead, but to remove the symbol of inmate power that now sways in full view of 700 prisoners. Second, separate the 5 survivors immediately and completely, ensuring they cannot coordinate their stories before interrogation begins. Third, lock down the entire prison until the administration can determine how extensively this conspiracy has spread. The body comes down with a sound like a sack of grain hitting concrete. Thomas Kellerman's face, purple and swollen, stares sightlessly at the gray sky as prison doctor Marcus Reed pronounces him dead at 9:47 a.m. on April 1st, 1879. The official cause will be recorded as asphyxiation by hanging, but the real cause runs deeper. A systemic failure disguised as individual choice, an architecture of violence mistaken for justice. The 5 survivors are marched to solitary confinement in single file, each man flanked by 2 guards, none allowed to speak or even look at his companions. Their names will be recorded in the incident report: William Hatch, the forger who shared Kellerman's cell; James Morrison, serving 10 years for armed robbery; Samuel Burke, a murderer whose sentence was commuted from death to life; Miguel Santos, convicted of assault with intent to kill; and David Chen, the only one among them who claims he was not involved in the actual killing but merely failed to prevent it. Each man tells the same story during interrogation, a story so consistent in its details that it can only be either completely true or completely rehearsed. They were working on the walkway when Kellerman simply climbed over the railing and jumped. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late to save him. They found the rope around his neck, but they didn't put it there. They witnessed a suicide, not a murder, and their only crime was failing to prevent a desperate man from ending his own life. The story is preposterous, and everyone knows it. Suicide victims don't fashion their own nooses and then climb railings to hang themselves. They don't position their bodies so that the rope bears all the weight while their hands remain free of defensive wounds. They don't die without leaving behind some record of despair, some note or confession that explains their final choice. But the story is also unprovable in its falseness, which makes it perfect for an institution that values stability over truth. To prove murder, the administration would need witnesses willing to testify, evidence that points clearly to specific individuals, and a legal system capable of processing the case without exposing the deeper failures that made the killing possible. None of these things exist, and everyone with any sense understands that pursuing them would create more problems than it would solve. Warden Samuel Crawford, a political appointee whose experience with corrections extends primarily to his campaign contributions to the current governor, faces a choice that will define both his career and the institution he supposedly leads. He can treat Kellerman's death as murder, launching an investigation that will inevitably reveal the systematic breakdown of security and supervision that made the killing possible. Or he can treat it as suicide, accepting a lie that protects everyone except the truth. The decision is made before the sun sets on April 1st. Thomas Kellerman died by his own hand, overcome by despair and guilt over his cooperation with prison authorities. The 5 inmates who witnessed his final moments will be transferred to other institutions for their own safety, not as punishment for participation in murder, but as protection from potential retaliation by inmates who might blame them for failing to prevent a fellow prisoner's death. The paperwork is completed with bureaucratic efficiency. Death certificate, suicide. Incident report, inmate self-harm. Recommendations, increase psychological evaluation of inmates showing signs of depression or anxiety. No mention of inadequate supervision. No discussion of architectural blind spots. No acknowledgement that the prison's design makes such incidents inevitable rather than exceptional. But paperwork cannot contain the truth any more than walls can contain the information that flows between cells like water finding its level. Within hours of Kellerman's death, Every inmate in the Ohio State Penitentiary knows exactly what happened and why. The official story of suicide fools no one, intimidates no one, and changes nothing about the fundamental dynamic that made the killing necessary in the first place. If anything, the official denial of reality makes the inmates' alternative justice system stronger. The state has proven that it cannot protect those who serve its interests, cannot investigate those who violate its rules, and cannot maintain the basic order that justifies its authority. Power, as always, flows to those willing to exercise it, and the inmates have demonstrated their willingness in terms too clear to be misunderstood. The night after Kellerman's death brings a silence deeper than usual to the cell blocks. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of listening. 700 men lying awake in their bunks, processing what they have learned about the world they inhabit and their place within it. Some feel satisfaction that justice has been served. Others feel fear that they might be next. All understand that something fundamental has shifted in the balance of power that governs their daily lives. The guards feel it too. They walk their rounds with new awareness of their vulnerability, new understanding of how quickly routine can become catastrophe. The walkway where Kellerman died becomes a place they avoid when possible, patrol quickly when avoidance isn't an option. The blind spots that enable the killing now seem to multiply, creating shadows where shadows shouldn't exist, and fostering paranoia that may or may not be justified. Warden Crawford calls a staff meeting for April 3rd, ostensibly to discuss new security procedures but actually to gauge whether his employees believe the official story they're required to support. The answer becomes clear within minutes. Everyone knows that Thomas Kellerman was murdered, everyone understands why the murder was officially reclassified as suicide, and everyone accepts their role in maintaining a fiction that protects the institution at the expense of truth. The new security procedures are modest and largely cosmetic. Work details will include an additional guard when possible, though staffing shortages make this more aspiration than policy. Inmates showing signs of depression will be monitored more closely, though the prison lacks both the personnel and expertise to make such monitoring meaningful. Most importantly, informants will be housed in protective custody when their identities become known, though this protection will depend on resources that don't exist and vigilance that is already proven inadequate. These measures satisfy the bureaucratic need to demonstrate responsiveness while changing nothing about the underlying conditions that made Kellerman's death inevitable. The walkway remains poorly supervised. The blind spots remain hidden from official view. The acoustic networks that carry information continue to operate beyond the reach of guards who hear only what they're meant to hear. And in the cells and workshops and dining halls where the real business of prison life unfolds, the lesson of Thomas Kellerman's death is absorbed and internalized. The state's justice may be official, but it's not reliable. The guard's protection may be promised, but it's not permanent. The only justice that matters is the justice you can deliver yourself, and the only protection that counts is the protection you earn through solidarity with those who share your fate. Spring deepens into summer, and life at the Ohio State Penitentiary settles into new rhythms shaped by the knowledge of what's possible when official authority proves inadequate to the task of maintaining order. The staff pretends that nothing has changed while secretly acknowledging that everything has. The inmates pretend that Kellerman killed himself while knowing exactly who killed him and why. This mutual pretense creates a strange stability, a balance of power based on shared lies rather than shared truths. The guards maintain their illusion of control by accepting limits on what they can control. The inmates maintain their alternative justice system by accepting the fiction that it doesn't exist, and the administration maintains its authority by refusing to acknowledge the ways in which that authority has been compromised, circumvented, and ultimately rendered irrelevant. The walkway where Thomas Kellerman died is repaired and returned to service within a week. The loose boards are secured, the railings are reinforced, and the structure is declared safe for continued use. But safety, in the context of a building designed to hold desperate men with nothing to lose, is always relative. The same railing that now meets all official standards for structural integrity once supported the weight of a man dying for his betrayal of the inmate code. Guard Peterson requests transfer to a different assignment, claiming that supervising work details doesn't suit his temperament. His replacement, Guard Martinez, is warned about the need for constant vigilance, but not told why such vigilance is necessary. The institutional memory that might prevent future tragedies is deliberately suppressed in favor of maintaining the fiction that past tragedies never occurred. The 5 inmates who witnessed Kellerman's death are indeed transferred to other institutions, scattered across Ohio to prevent them from comparing their experiences or coordinating their stories. William Hatch goes to the reformatory in Mansfield. James Morrison is sent to the workhouse in Cincinnati. Samuel Burke finds himself at the penitentiary in Youngstown. Miguel Santos and David Chen are shipped to facilities in Toledo and Dayton, respectively. But physical separation cannot contain the story they carry with them. Within months, inmates across Ohio's prison system know about the hanging at the Columbus Penitentiary, know about the official cover-up that followed, and know about the new balance of power that emerged from the confrontation between state authority and inmate justice. The story spreads because it contains a truth more compelling than official lies: that prisoners can successfully challenge the system that holds them, that collaboration with authorities offers no real protection, and that justice, however rough and irregular, remains possible even in places designed to crush the human spirit. The Ohio State Penitentiary develops a reputation that extends far beyond its walls. Judges sentencing criminals begin to mention it specifically as a place where cooperation with authorities is discouraged and where the usual prison hierarchies operate under different rules. Defense attorneys use the threat of assignment there as leverage in plea negotiations. Police officers investigating crimes find that suspects who might normally consider informing think twice when they learn where informants end up. This reputation becomes a form of power in itself, a deterrent that operates through fear rather than force. The prison doesn't need to kill more informants to discourage collaboration. The memory of Thomas Kellerman's death serves that function perfectly. His hanging becomes a story told in whispers throughout Ohio's criminal underworld, a cautionary tale that shapes behavior far from the walls where he died. But power based on fear is inherently unstable, requiring constant reinforcement to maintain its effectiveness. The inmates who executed their own justice against Kellerman cannot rest on their success. They must be prepared to act again when the next informant emerges, when the next betrayal threatens the solidarity that has become their only protection against an indifferent system. And informants will emerge because the basic dynamics that created Thomas Kellerman haven't changed. The prison remains understaffed, overcrowded, and dependent on information from inmates to maintain even the illusion of control. Guards will continue to recruit collaborators, administrators will continue to promise protection they cannot deliver, and desperate men will continue to make choices that seem rational in isolation, but prove fatal in the context of a community that values loyalty above all other virtues. The architecture that enabled Kellerman's murder, the blind spots, the acoustic networks, the walkways with inadequate supervision, remains unchanged because changing it would require acknowledging that it had failed in the first place. The official story of suicide must be maintained, which means the conditions that made murder possible must be preserved. The building itself becomes complicit in the violence it was designed to prevent, creating spaces where unofficial justice can operate beyond the reach of official authority. By autumn, Thomas Kellerman's name is rarely spoken aloud within the prison walls, but his presence lingers in every conversation about cooperation with guards, every whisper about information that might be passed along, every calculation about whether temporary privileges are worth permanent exile from the community of the condemned. His death has become a permanent part of the prison's unofficial constitution, an amendment written in blood and enforced by the same collective will that made his execution possible. The guards who worked most closely with Kellerman as an informant find themselves in an uncomfortable position. They know they bear some responsibility for his death, having recruited him for information while failing to protect him from the consequences of providing it. But acknowledging this responsibility would mean admitting that their entire approach to prison security is fundamentally flawed, that their reliance on inmate informants is not just ineffective but actively dangerous to those who cooperate. Instead, they adapt their methods while maintaining their official position. Informants are recruited more carefully, with greater attention to their ability to avoid detection by other inmates. Information is gathered more subtly, through casual conversations rather than obvious exchanges. And protection, when promised at all, is hedged with qualifications that make clear its limitations without explicitly acknowledging those limitations. These adaptations preserve the system while acknowledging its failures, a typically bureaucratic response that changes everything while changing nothing. The fundamental dynamic remains the same. The prison depends on information from inmates to maintain control, but cannot protect those who provide that information once their identities become known. Thomas Kellerman's death solved nothing and changed nothing except the level of awareness among all parties about the lethal nature of the game they continue to play. As winter approaches again, bringing with it the same cold that contributed to the tensions leading to Kellerman's death, the Ohio State Penitentiary settles into its new reality. The official story maintains that no murder occurred, but everyone behaves as if murder remains possible, probable, and justified under certain circumstances. The guards maintain their authority through force and routine, but acknowledge that this authority has limits beyond their control. The inmates maintain their alternative justice system through silence and solidarity, but understand that this system exists at the sufferance of an administration that could crush it if the costs of doing so weren't higher than the costs of tolerating it. This balance will hold for months, maybe years, sustained by the mutual recognition that everyone's survival depends on maintaining fictions that no one quite believes. But balance based on lies is always precarious, always vulnerable to the kind of crisis that forces truth into the light where it cannot be ignored or denied, and in a place like the Ohio State Penitentiary, where 700 desperate men live in conditions designed to break their spirits and crush their hopes. Crisis is not a possibility but a certainty, not a matter of whether, but when. The legacy of Thomas Kellerman's death will outlive the building where he died, outlive the men who killed him, outlive the guards who failed to protect him. It will become part of the mythology of American corrections, a story that illustrates the eternal tension between official justice and the rougher justice of the dispossessed. But for now it remains a local story, a prison story, a cautionary tale whispered in the darkness of cells where men count days until freedom or death, whichever comes first. The years that follow Thomas Kellerman's death blur together in the way that time always moves in places designed to make time meaningless. The seasons change outside the prison walls, but inside, the rhythms remain constant. Roll call and work details, meals and lockdowns, the endless counting of days that stretch into decades for some and end abruptly for others. The Ohio State Penitentiary settles into its role as more than a correctional institution. It becomes a laboratory for the study of power and its limits, a place where theories of justice collide with the brutal reality of human nature under pressure. The hanging of Thomas Kellerman becomes institutional memory, passed down through generations of inmates who never knew the man but understand his significance. New arrivals learn his story within days of their arrival, not from official orientation, but from the whispered conversations that constitute the real education in prison survival. His name becomes synonymous with the price of betrayal, his death a cautionary tale that shapes behavior throughout the complex. But memory, even collective memory, fades without periodic reinforcement. By 1882, 3 years after Kellerman's death, the Ohio State Penitentiary houses nearly 1,500 inmates in facilities designed for 1,200. The overcrowding that contributed to the original tensions has worsened, creating new pressures that demand new outlets. The walkway where Kellerman died has been renamed the Memorial Bridge by inmates who appreciate irony, though guards continue to call it by its original designation, unwilling to acknowledge that the structure has acquired meaning beyond its architectural function. The administration, under pressure from state legislators who demand both lower costs and higher security, implements new policies designed to improve efficiency. Work details are expanded, with inmates now employed in manufacturing operations that generate revenue for the state. Educational programs are introduced, offering basic literacy classes and vocational training that supposedly prepare prisoners for reintegration into society. Religious services are expanded, with multiple chaplains representing different denominations ministering to the spiritual needs of men whose greatest need may be hope itself. These reforms represent genuine efforts to transform the penitentiary from a warehouse for the unwanted into something resembling the rehabilitative institution its founders claimed to envision. But reform, like revolution, often produces consequences its architects never anticipate. The expanded work programs create new opportunities for the kind of collaboration between inmates and guards that led to Kellerman's death. The educational initiatives bring together inmates from different cell blocks, facilitating communication networks that transcend the architectural barriers designed to prevent coordination. Even the religious programs, intended to promote moral transformation, become venues for the kind of discussions that can only occur when men believe their conversations are protected by divine confidentiality. The prison's population continues to evolve, reflecting changes in Ohio's criminal justice system and broader social conditions. The original inmates, men like those who killed Kellerman, are joined by a new generation of prisoners, whose crimes and attitudes reflect the changing nature of American society. Some are veterans of the Civil War, men whose experience with organized violence makes them natural leaders in the prison's informal hierarchy. Others are immigrants from Europe and Asia, bringing cultural perspectives that complicate the simple racial divisions that have traditionally organized prison life. These demographic changes create new tensions and new alliances, but they don't alter the fundamental dynamic that made Kellerman's death inevitable. Information remains currency, silence remains survival, and betrayal remains a death sentence carried out by men who have appointed themselves judges and executioners. The faces change, the specific grievances evolve, but the underlying structure of inmate justice persists because the underlying conditions that created it remain unchanged. The guards, too, represent an evolving demographic. The original staff, hired when the prison opened, are gradually replaced by younger men who lack direct experience with the institution's bloody history. They know about Kellerman's death from files and briefings, but they don't carry the visceral understanding that comes from working in a place where their failure to maintain vigilance has already cost lives. This generational shift creates opportunities for both reform and regression, moments when established patterns might be disrupted by fresh perspectives or reinforced by the repetition of old mistakes. Guard Captain Robert Hayes, promoted to his position in 1884, represents this new generation of prison staff. A veteran of the Indian Wars who understands both leadership and violence, Hayes approaches his responsibilities with the systematic thinking of a military professional rather than the ad hoc improvisation that has characterized prison security since the institution opened. He studies the Kellerman incident as a case study in operational failure, analyzing the breakdown in supervision and communication that enabled the killing. Hayes's analysis leads to recommendations that might have prevented Kellerman's death had they been implemented years earlier. Work details should never operate with fewer than 2 guards, eliminating the single points of failure that created opportunities for violence. Blind spots in the prison's architecture should be eliminated through strategic placement of mirrors and lighting, ensuring that every space remains visible to authorized personnel. Most importantly, informants should be housed in dedicated facilities separate from the general population, removing them from the reach of inmate justice entirely. But Hayes's recommendations run headlong into the same financial constraints that shaped the prison's original design. Adding guards requires expanding the budget, something state legislators are reluctant to authorize when they can point to the institution's apparent stability as evidence that current staffing levels are adequate. Installing mirrors and improved lighting requires capital expenditures that compete with other state priorities, from road construction to public education. And building separate facilities for protective custody represents a fundamental acknowledgement that the current system has failed, an admission that political figures are unwilling to make public. The result is a series of modest reforms that address symptoms while leaving the underlying disease untreated. Work details now operate under slightly enhanced supervision but the supervision remains inadequate for the task. The most obvious blind spots are eliminated, but the acoustic networks that enable covert communication remain intact. And informants continue to be housed within the general population, protected only by promises that everyone understands cannot be kept when the resources to keep them don't exist. These half measures create their own problems. Inmates adapt to the new security procedures, finding workarounds for the enhanced supervision and alternative communication methods to replace those that have been disrupted. The modifications to the prison's physical structure eliminate some hiding places while inadvertently creating others, as contractors unfamiliar with correctional architecture install improvements that interact with existing systems in unexpected ways. And the continued reliance on inmate informants, despite the proven inadequacy of protection systems, creates a steady stream of potential victims who make the same calculations that led to Thomas Kellerman's cooperation and death. By 1885, 6 years after the Kellerman incident, the Ohio State Penitentiary has achieved a kind of equilibrium based on mutual understanding of acceptable violence. Guards understand that certain inmates will die under certain circumstances, and they focus their protective efforts on preventing the kinds of spectacular incidents that generate newspaper coverage and legislative investigations. Inmates understand that certain forms of collaboration will be punished by death, and they regulate their own behavior accordingly, saving their violence for targets who have violated codes that predate any written law. This equilibrium is tested periodically by incidents that threaten to upset the careful balance between official authority and inmate justice. A guard is attacked during a routine cell inspection, beaten unconscious but not killed, sending a message about the limits of acceptable enforcement without crossing the line into the kind of violence that demands official retaliation. An inmate suspected of informing disappears from his cell during the night, his body never found but his absence understood by everyone as confirmation that the old penalties remain in effect. These incidents are investigated with the perfunctory thoroughness that has become standard practice. Statements are taken, reports are filed, and recommendations are made for security enhancements that will be implemented when resources permit, which is to say, never. The investigations serve their real purpose, which is not to solve crimes but to demonstrate institutional responsiveness while avoiding discoveries that might force uncomfortable acknowledgments about the nature of the system everyone serves. The prison's reputation continues to evolve throughout the 1880s, shaped by stories that spread through Ohio's criminal justice system and beyond. Defense attorneys warn clients about the risks of cooperation with authorities, using the fate of Thomas Kellerman as an example of what happens to inmates who choose collaboration over solidarity. Police officers find that suspects who might once have been willing to provide information about accomplices now weigh those decisions more carefully, understanding that their cooperation might follow them into institutions where cooperation is punished more harshly than any crime. This reputation creates its own form of deterrence, discouraging not just criminal behavior, but the kind of cooperation with authorities that criminal justice systems depend upon to function effectively. The paradox is perfect. A prison designed to support law enforcement has become a source of resistance to law enforcement, its very existence undermining the collaborative relationships between criminals and police that solve cases and prevent crimes. The irony extends beyond law enforcement to the broader question of corrections itself. The Ohio State Penitentiary was built to demonstrate that crime doesn't pay, that lawbreaking leads inevitably to punishment and isolation from society. But the institution that was meant to vindicate official justice has instead created its own alternative justice system, one that operates according to principles older and in some ways more reliable than those enshrined in courtrooms and law books. This alternative system proves remarkably durable, surviving changes in administration, modifications to physical infrastructure, and reforms intended to address its underlying causes. It persists because it serves functions that the official system cannot or will not perform, providing protection for those who cannot protect themselves and punishment for those whose crimes go unacknowledged by official authorities. It represents a form of governance that emerges naturally in any community where official governance has proven inadequate to the task of maintaining order and justice. The men who killed Thomas Kellerman have long since been transferred, paroled, or died in custody, but their legacy lives on in the institutional culture they helped to create. New inmates learn the rules they established, internalize the values they demonstrated, and perpetuate the system they built through their willingness to enforce its penalties. The specific individuals change, but the collective commitment to inmate justice remains constant, passed down through generations of prisoners who understand that their survival depends on maintaining solidarity against forces that see them as less than human. This culture extends beyond the walls of the Ohio State Penitentiary, carried by released inmates who remember the lessons they learned inside and by guards who transfer to other institutions with knowledge of how alternative justice systems operate. The hanging of Thomas Kellerman becomes part of a larger mythology about resistance to authority, proof that even the most powerless people can exercise power when they act collectively and with sufficient determination. But mythology, however compelling, cannot obscure the brutal reality of what actually happened on that walkway in 1879. A man died because he made choices that his fellow inmates found unacceptable, executed by men who appointed themselves judges in a system that recognized no appeals and offered no mercy. The killing was efficient, coordinated, and ultimately successful in achieving its intended goals, eliminating a perceived threat to inmate solidarity and sending a message that would discourage similar betrayals in the future. The success of that unofficial execution creates expectations for future unofficial executions, establishing precedents that make similar violence not just possible, but inevitable. The architecture that enabled Kellerman's death, the blind spots, the inadequate supervision, the structural elements that could support the weight of a hanging body, remains unchanged, waiting for the next informant whose cooperation with authorities will be judged unacceptable by men who have nothing left to lose except their lives and their principles. And principles, in a place like the Ohio State Penitentiary, can be more dangerous than weapons, more powerful than walls, more enduring than the lives of the men who sacrifice everything to uphold them. The principle that betrayal deserves death has been established through blood, and blood, once spilled for a principle, sanctifies that principle in ways that law and policy cannot match. As the 1880s draw to a close, the Ohio State Penitentiary stands as a monument to the complexity of justice in America, a place where competing concepts of right and wrong collide in ways that illuminate the tensions inherent in any system that attempts to govern human behavior through force. The building was designed to demonstrate the power of official authority, but it has instead become a showcase for the persistence of unofficial authority, the kind of power that emerges naturally when official power proves inadequate to the task of protecting those it claims to serve. The walkway where Thomas Kellerman died continues to serve its intended function, connecting the main prison building to the industrial complex where inmates labor for the benefit of a society that has rejected them. But it also serves as a reminder of the limits of architectural solutions to human problems, proof that buildings designed to prevent violence can instead enable violence when the systems meant to govern them fail to account for the resourcefulness of desperate people. The rope that killed Kellerman has long since been discarded, but the knowledge of how to fashion such rope from available materials has become part of the prison's oral tradition, passed down through generations of inmates who understand that survival sometimes requires the ability to kill. The techniques are simple, the materials readily available, the opportunity predictable for anyone patient enough to wait for the inevitable moment when supervision fails and justice becomes a personal responsibility rather than an institutional function. This knowledge represents power, and power, once acquired, is rarely surrendered voluntarily. The inmates who learned how to kill Thomas Kellerman learned something more valuable than any skill taught in the prison's vocational programs. They learned that they could act collectively to enforce their own standards of acceptable behavior, that they could create their own justice system when the official system failed them, that they could exercise ultimate authority over life and death despite being held in a system designed to strip them of all authority. That knowledge will outlive the building where it was acquired, outlive the men who first exercised it, outlive the specific circumstances that made its exercise necessary. it will become part of the permanent legacy of the Ohio State Penitentiary, a contribution to American culture that its founders never intended but cannot disavow. The hanging of Thomas Kellerman will be remembered long after his name is forgotten, not as an individual tragedy, but as an illustration of truths about power and justice that transcend the specific time and place where those truths were written in blood on a walkway, designed for purposes that had nothing to do with execution, but everything to do with the exercise of power in its purest and most brutal form.